Hey guys, tonight we descend into a corner of history that creaks with wooden shoes, smells faintly of wet straw, and echoes with accusations you never thought could be uttered in a court of law. You probably imagine the justice system as something stiff and severe, robes and gavels and men with serious foreheads. But in the hush pages of medieval record books, there's something else hiding a memory of squeaking paws, twitching whiskers, and the peculiar formality of summoning a mouse to court. Yes, really, these stories don't shout, they whisper from the margins, concealed between church chronicles and farming logs. They remind us of how deeply people once wanted the world to make sense, even when that world was being devoured by grain-thieving vermin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a dirt road toward a quiet village in 14th century France. It smells like sour bread and wood smoke. A bell tolls in the distance, not for a funeral or mass, but for a trial. In the village square, the crowd gathers, not to see a thief or a murderer dragged before the judge, but to hear the case against several dozen mice, the crime eating through stores of barley and oats. The plaintiffs are the monks who cultivated and harvested the fields. The accused nowhere in sight. That doesn't stop the proceedings. The court clerk reads the charges aloud. Latin phrases roll from his tongue with solemnity: mus musculus, accused of theft, destruction of property, and public disturbance. You blink. Are they serious? Oh, completely. In fact, they've appointed a defense lawyer for the mice. Enter Barthélemy Chassanet, a young but ambitious legal scholar. He's not a joke, far from it. Historians still argue whether Chassanet believed in the case or just saw an opportunity to build his reputation. Either way, his performance would echo across legal history, his strategy genius in its absurdity. He argued that the mice were not properly summoned. The court had issued the summons by public proclamation, but Chassanet insisted that it wasn't loud enough or widespread enough for all mice to hear it. You almost laugh, but then you realize he's playing the game by its own rules, and winning. When pressed, he pushed harder. Even if the mice had heard the summons, he said, they couldn't possibly be expected to appear in court because the roads were filled with cats and other predators. It wouldn't be safe. This wasn't a comedy skit. The judges took it seriously. They deliberated. They postponed. They extended the summons and then delayed the trial again when the mice shockingly failed to appear. No one pointed out the obvious. No one threw their hands up and shouted, "They're just mice." Instead, they treated the case as if the very structure of divine and legal order depended on the outcome. And maybe, in their world, it did. The medieval mind didn't always separate the physical from the spiritual. Pests weren't just annoyances. They were seen as punishments or portents. If mice were devouring crops, it wasn't just about hunger, it was about sin, imbalance, and divine displeasure. That's why the court was the right place to address it. This wasn't pest control. It was cosmic repair. But there's a certain charm to the logic, if you squint. If mice are moral creatures capable of crime, they deserve a defense. It's oddly fair, ridiculous, but fair. Chassanet made his case with a calm voice and endless patience, like a man describing the legal rights of ghosts or arguing a land dispute with the moon. His tone never wavered. He spoke of the mice as if they were upstanding members of the community's citizens with duties and fears, and in doing so, he subtly reminded the judges of their own fears: plague, famine, wrath from above. Maybe they weren't really judging mice at all. Maybe they were trying to reassure themselves that the world still worked according to rules, even when it clearly didn't. Quirky detail. In some versions of these trials, the accused animals were referred to with full legal names, sometimes even given representatives from neighboring villages, as if mice had municipal affiliations. There's one delightful record where the clerk specifies the whole community of rodents dwelling in and around the barns of Saint-Pierre. Imagine that on a summons. Another record from Switzerland shows a judge delaying a case against beetles because they had not yet been adequately notified. You think of modern legal notices getting lost in the mail? Now imagine a beetle saying, "Sorry, I didn't receive it." One sleepy afternoon in 1519 in autumn France, Chassanet once again stood in court to defend animals this time. A group of rats accused of destroying barley crops. As in the mouse case, he argued for their right to a fair trial, safety of travel, and full legal process. And again, the court listened. They deliberated. Eventually, the case faded, unresolved. The rats had dodged justice, or perhaps justice had dodged absurdity. Either way, Chassanet became a legend. He would go on to write legal commentaries still cited in serious academic discussions. Not bad for a guy who once made the case for vermin. You start to notice how the logic unfolds with the softness of a dream. It makes no sense by daylight, but within the sleepy fog of medieval belief, it seems almost right. In that world, the fields are sacred, the harvest is life, and anything that threatens it, be it a mouse, a drought, or a whisper of witchcraft, must be addressed with formality. You imagine a monk standing by the court steps, squinting into the bushes for a sign that the rodents might approach the bench. He waits with the hope of someone who truly believes the world can still be reasoned with. There's a slowness to it that feels oddly soothing, justice at a snail's pace. You picture the parchment, the quills, the robes. You picture the silence of the courtroom, broken only by the caw of distant crows. One scholar wrote that these animal trials weren't about animals at all. They were ritual dramas for human reassurance, and in that sense, they succeeded. The mice were never convicted, but neither were they acquitted. They simply vanished from the docket, like shadows leaving a wall when the candles go out. And you're left with this quiet village, a courtroom full of robes and scrolls, and a mouse that no one ever caught, scurrying away with a kernel of grain clutched in its teeth. Maybe the mouse never knew it was summoned. Or maybe it heard the bell and chose not to come. You stay seated on the creaky bench in that dim medieval courtroom, the scent of wax and damp earth still lingering. But today, the case feels heavier. There's a crowd pressing close to the wooden railing, heads craning, children hoisted onto shoulders. This isn't about mice or rats anymore. The accused is already here, chained, snorting, swaying slightly in the sunlight. It's a pig, a full-grown sow, smeared with mud, its hide cut and crusted with dried blood. She doesn't know she's on trial, but everyone else does. This is 1386 in Falaise, France, and the charge is murder. Specifically, the pig is accused of attacking and killing a child, and not just any child, the infant of a local nobleman's servant. So the trial must proceed. There's a judge, there's a scribe, there's a lawyer appointed to defend the pig, and there's a tailor who's been hired for a special commission. The pig has been dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, and breeches, the same color as a human criminal's execution garb. Historians still argue whether this grotesque fashion choice was meant to humiliate the pig, symbolically humanize it, or both. But to the villagers, the message is clear: this beast has done something unforgivable. It has crossed the line between animal instinct and moral transgression, and now it must face the consequences. You watch as the trial unfolds with eerie precision. Witnesses are called. The child's mother testifies. She saw the pig attack, describes the blood, the panic, the child's cries. The prosecution paints the sow as unusually aggressive, possibly demonic. The defense tries to argue that the child may have provoked it, or that the animal had been mistreated. But sympathy is thin. The courtroom shifts in tone. What began as spectacle now feels grim, like a village trying to scrub away guilt with ritual. And the sentence, when it comes, is swift. The pig will be publicly executed by hanging. You think that must be exaggeration, but no. There's a record, detailed, official, stamped with the seal of authority. The pig was hanged by its hind legs in the town square, just like a man. Crowds gathered, bells tolled, and if anyone thought it strange to execute a pig like a person, they didn't say so. They simply watched. Some brought food, some crossed themselves, some looked away, but they came. The strange paradox of the scene wraps itself around you like a slow mist. This pig, unaware of law or morality, becomes the vessel for a community's outrage, grief, and craving for order. You begin to see that these trials are not just about the accused. They are about restoring the illusion that the world is still knowable, still ruled by law, even when chaos strikes close to home. It wasn't the only case. In Savigny, Burgundy, Another pig was tried and burned at the stake for infanticide. In Lavigny, 3 piglets were found guilty of mauling a child and sentenced to death, but only after a debate about whether they had acted on their own or under their mother's influence. And here's the fringe details sometimes. Animals were pardoned. In one case, piglets were spared because there was no proof they had partaken of the act. Yes, they were acquitted for lack of evidence. You can almost imagine a medieval CSI team dusting hoof prints and inspecting bite marks. The absurdity runs deep, but it's not pure comedy. These were real communities, real grieving parents, real deaths. The courts weren't just playing dress up, they were performing a kind of spiritual maintenance. The death of a child needed meaning, and if that meaning could be nailed to a beast and then purged in public, then maybe the town could breathe again. The presence of the church in all this looms quietly. In some towns, animal trials were held in ecclesiastical courts. The church believed animals could be used by the devil, that they could be corrupted by evil, especially pigs. Why pigs? Well, in Christian symbolism, pigs were often associated with gluttony, lust, and impurity. Remember the biblical scene where demons flee into a herd of swine and drown themselves in the sea? That image stuck. Pigs became the perfect scapegoats for moral rot, and in these trials, they were treated accordingly, accused of knowing sin, not just instinct. But there's a strange moment of empathy lurking beneath it all. The pig has a defense lawyer. It stands trial. Not slaughtered outright, it is seen as worthy of process. It's ludicrous, but there's something buried in the logic, a confused echo of what would later become animal rights, a flicker of dignity wrapped in horror. These trials gave animals personhood, however warped. They could be accused, punished, even exonerated. You wonder if, in some twisted way, it was a sign of respect, or maybe it was just projection humans seeing their own violence mirrored in the natural world, and needing to stamp it out. There's a dark humor that bubbles up around the edges of these stories. You can't help it. It's the sight of a pig in a tailored suit. It's the phrase, repeat offender, applied to a goat. It's imagining a clerk taking notes on a cow's facial expression. But it's also heavy, because beneath the absurdity lies the fear that these people were trying to exorcise, that the world was senseless, that innocent children could die for no reason, that the divine plan was not a plan at all. So instead, they constructed one. They built a fragile theater of justice and put a pig on center stage. Even stranger, these records were preserved. They were copied, bound, archived. You can still read them today, not just in obscure chronicles, but in formal legal codices. They list the crime, the evidence, the ruling, the cost of execution. Sometimes there are notes about reimbursement to the hangman or the blacksmith who built the gallows. It's all there accounted for like any other case. And you feel the full medieval weight of that bureaucracy, the slow ink, the drying parchment, the stamp of the seal. Even absurdity has a filing cabinet. You imagine being a child in that town, growing up with the story of the hanged pig. You'd walk past the gallows. You'd hear the tale whispered in kitchens and muttered in the churchyard. It would become myth and warning and bedtime lesson all at once. Don't stray too close to animals. Don't break the rules, or you, too, could end up on trial. The line between man and beast was thin, and sometimes it snapped. The pig doesn't know. It never knows. It trembles. It squeals. It resists. And then it's gone. But the town feels cleansed. For a while, until the next unexplainable horror comes knocking. The clamor of the last trial still lingers in your ears as you shuffle down a narrow village lane, where chickens peck at the ground and small boys toss pebbles into muddy puddles. At a glance, it looks like any other sleepy hamlet, until you notice the villagers whispering near the chapel steps, pointing toward the town square. There's another trial today, but this one is stranger still. The accused is not a pig or a goat or even a dog. It's a rooster, a proud, feathered, sharp-clawed rooster with a puffed chest and a defiant glare, being kept in a small wooden cage as though he were a dangerous criminal. The charge, laying an egg. And not just any egg, a smooth, pale, unblemished sphere of such perfection that someone in the village decided it could only have been laid by a demonic creature. The year is 1474, and you're in Basel, Switzerland. Someone saw the egg, watched the rooster walk away from it, and concluded the unthinkable. This was the work of Satan. Because, you see, rooster eggs, if they exist, are said to hatch into basilisks. That's right, the legendary creature that could kill with a glance. A creature born not from any hen, but from a cock's cursed egg, warmed in manure and hatred. That was the lore. And in a world still wrapped in fear of witchcraft and heresy, no one laughed. They built a case. They summoned witnesses. The egg was presented as Exhibit A, cradled in cloth as though it were a holy relic or a bomb. The rooster's defense, silence, naturally, but the court wasn't interested in what it had to say. What mattered was what it had done or what it might do, because this wasn't just a trial about biology gone rogue. It was about possibility, about fear wrapped in feathers, the unknown dressed in the everyday. Historians still argue whether this trial was symbolic or sincerely feared. Did the townspeople really believe a rooster could birth a basilisk? Or was this just another convenient outlet for their anxieties, their need for purity, control, and moral cleanliness? Either way, the verdict was serious. The rooster was found guilty of unnatural behavior and satanic influence. It was sentenced to death, not by fire or hanging, but by formal beheading, as though decapitating the bird would cut the evil out of the world itself. And so, the execution was held. The town square once again filled with people. The rooster squawked, confused, wings flapping against the confines of its small wooden prison. It had no idea it had offended theological orthodoxy. It just laid an egg, maybe. Or maybe the egg came from somewhere else entirely, and no one cared to check. Either way, its fate was sealed. The axe fell, the crowd watched, and somewhere in the court records, a clerk wrote the word sentence carried out in full accordance with custom. The surreal part isn't just the trial. It's the fact that these proceedings were cloaked in the full solemnity of law and ritual. The same structures meant to protect people from each other were now wielded against a barnyard bird. And yet, the more you watch, the more you realize how much of this was about protecting people from fear itself. If the rooster was evil, and evil could be executed, then maybe the village was safe again. Maybe the nightmares would stop. There's a curious fringe detail to all this. Some 16th century German alchemists actually believed rooster eggs had mystical properties. One wrote that such an egg, buried under a church during a full moon, could attract either divine favor or unearthly power, depending on the rooster's intent. You chuckle at the phrase rooster's intent, but then wonder, is that really more absurd than what the court believed? Probably not. You sit for a moment under the eaves of the chapel and reflect on the logic. In a time when magic and faith interwove with every crop cycle, when thunder was considered a message and illness a punishment, what else could people do but put the strange things on trial? You remember that this was an era where witches were burned, heretics flayed, and comets seen as omens. The rooster, then, was just a minor player in a grander play one where everything had meaning, and nothing happened by accident. Even the egg became a character, handled like evidence in a murder case, feared, whispered about, sometimes even destroyed in secret rituals. Some priests recommended boiling them in holy water, others buried them at crossroads. A few, with more flair for the dramatic, smashed eggs at midnight while chanting psalms backward. All of this because of a rooster that may or may not have done something unusual. You wonder what it must have felt like to be a child watching that trial. To see a bird, something you'd fed crumbs to, suddenly paraded as a monster. Would you start looking differently at all animals? Would you worry that your own pet might be possessed? Or would you internalize a deeper lesson that even the familiar can be terrifying? That the ordinary might hide the infernal just beneath the surface? There's a soft tragedy wrapped around the comedy. A rooster on trial is funny until you see the fear behind it. The villagers weren't laughing. They were trembling, praying, organizing the chaos of life into neat categories, holy or profane, safe or damned. That rooster became the scapegoat for the town's uncertainty. Its nervousness about change, weather, sickness, dreams that disturbed too deeply, and when its head rolled, they felt clean. One last twist. This trial wasn't an anomaly. There were similar cases across Europe. Roosters, hens, and even geese accused of unnatural behaviors, some tied to witchcraft, others to demonic signs. One 15th century Italian court deliberated over whether a chicken's sudden crowing at night meant it had made a pact with the devil. The verdict: immediate execution and a stern warning to the villagers not to keep talkative birds near windows. You smile at the image of a rooster being interrogated, but can't ignore how real the consequences were. The Rooster of Basel faded from memory, but its story survived, passed through dusty archives, cited in obscure legal texts, and whispered by historians as proof of just how far the law was willing to stretch to keep people from breaking, or perhaps to keep reality from fraying. You close your eyes and listen to the village settle down. The wind rustles thatched roofs, the scent of barley soup drifts from a distant window, and somewhere, another rooster crows, unaware that, centuries ago, one of its kind was once beheaded not for fighting or biting or running wild, but for doing something no one believed it could, or should. The rooster's cry fades into the mist of memory as you wander further into the folds of the medieval countryside, where the fields stretch in every direction and every breeze seems to carry a whisper of something unspoken. You find yourself in a quieter place now, a small village where stories cling to shadows and no one quite trusts a cat. The locals don't say much, but you can see it in their eyes when a black feline slinks past or perches atop a mossy gravestone, and if it hisses, oh, that's no coincidence. It's a warning. Here, cats are not just animals. They are suspected spies of Satan, companions of witches, creatures that move between the veils of the seen and the unseen. You feel the shift in the air. This is the age when superstition breathes hot and close on every neck. And for cats, it means suspicion, exile or worse, trial by fire. You stop by a wooden post where something once hung. A collar, a chain, maybe more. Stories swirl here of cats accused alongside their owners. Women mostly of consorting with the devil, attending secret sabbats, whispering in the language of demons. Historians still argue whether the widespread persecution of cats was truly rooted in theological fear, or whether it served a more insidious social purpose. Cats, after all, are independent, nocturnal, and hard to control. In a society obsessed with order, hierarchy, and obedience, that alone made them dangerous. Some chroniclers claim that Pope Gregory IX formally condemned cats in the 1230s, linking them to devil worship and causing their mass extermination across parts of Europe. Others suggest that the campaign was more fragmented, more opportunistic, less decree, more hysteria. Either way, the results were horrifyingly real. Villages staged public burnings of cats. Sometimes it was one cat, tied to a stake like a human heretic. Other times, it was dozens gathered up and thrown into fire pits during festivals meant to cleanse the town. There are records of Parisian celebrations where cats were suspended in baskets and lowered into flames. It was not justice. It was theater, catharsis, a grotesque ritual meant to reassure a frightened population that evil could be identified and destroyed. You sit with the strangeness of it all. Cats, who asked for nothing but a warm place to curl, suddenly cast as villains in the human imagination. But not all cats were seen the same. White cats were sometimes spared, associated with purity and the Virgin Mary. Black cats, however, bore the full weight of projected fear. They were said to walk with witches, to serve as familiars imbued with supernatural intelligence. If a woman had a cat, especially one that responded to her voice or followed her closely, it was enough to raise eyebrows and sometimes to build a case. In one infamous witch trial in 16th century Scotland, a woman named Agnes Sampson was accused of calling upon the devil through the help of her cat, who allegedly leapt into a fire during a storm, causing a shipwreck. The logic is flimsy, but the fear was not. The people believed. That was enough. And this belief had long consequences. You think of the Black Death, the plague that tore through Europe in waves, killing millions. Some scholars suggest that the widespread extermination of cats in the previous century may have contributed to the spread of the plague by allowing rat populations to surge unchecked. It's an ironic twist in trying to kill evil. They may have invited it in, but at the time, no one could have known. All they saw was a world out of balance, and all they wanted was something to blame. There's a small stone chapel at the edge of the village. You step inside. The air is cool, thick with incense and candle smoke. In the far corner, A worn mural shows Saint Dominic preaching to a crowd. At his feet is a dog, but also tucked discreetly in the shadows. A cat with eyes that seem to follow you. It's not labeled. It doesn't need to be. You can feel the tension. Even in sacred spaces, the cat is both guest and suspect. There's a quirky detail from Italian folklore. Some people believe that cats could steal your breath at night, not to kill you, but to absorb your soul's warmth. In rural households, mothers would shoo cats away from cradles, murmuring protective prayers. A baby smiling in its sleep was sometimes thought to be listening to a whispering cat. You smirk, because part of you still wonders what your own cat is thinking at night when it stares at a blank wall. But the fear went deeper. Cats were thought to be shapeshifters, witches in disguise. There are accounts of cats being struck down only to reveal blood of a suspiciously human hue. One French tale tells of a knight who injured a cat in battle, only to discover the town's herbalist limping the next day with the same wound. The coincidence was enough. She was arrested and later burned. No trial for the cat. The implication was punishment enough. These trials were rarely formal in the way pigs and roosters were tried. Cats were less likely to appear in court than to be dispatched in the streets, in barns, in homes. But their status as defendants still existed implied rather than written, lived rather than legislated. And once the Inquisition rolled in, the stakes rose. The inquisitors cared little for domestic quirks. They wanted conformity. They wanted obedience. A woman with a cat was a woman with secrets. A cat in the wrong place at the wrong time could doom its owner and itself. You step back outside. The sun is lower now. A cat darts across the road, pauses, and looks at you. Its tail flicks once. Its eyes gleam not with guilt or innocence, but with a kind of ancient disinterest, as if it remembers everything, and has decided none of it matters. You smile faintly. Maybe that's what made them dangerous. They didn't fear us the way we feared them. The trials faded slowly. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment thought spread and science replaced superstition, cats began their slow return to domestic life. They became companions again, not conspirators, but echoes of their persecution lingered in fairy tales, in idioms, in old women's warnings. And today, even with cats dominating memes and living plush lives, some of that ancestral suspicion lingers. A black cat crosses your path, and you still hesitate, just for a second. And you remember once, that flick of tail might have been enough to start a trial. The road stretches outward again, cobbled and uneven, as you drift from village to village, and now toward the edges of what feels like fairy tale and courtroom combined. You hear murmurs about a different sort of accused, less menacing, more ridiculous. Frogs. Specifically, frogs accused of disrupting public worship. It starts with a procession incense curling through the air, monks chanting in low Latin tones, villagers holding candles. The church bell tolls. But just as the priest raises his hand to bless the fields, a deep, wet croak breaks the solemnity. Then another, then dozens. The marsh nearby seems to erupt with laughter. The congregation turns, faces darken, croaking during the litany of saints. That, in some minds, is not coincidence. It's insult, insubordination, possibly even sacrilege. And so the frogs, by way of their collective crime, are summoned to court. It sounds like the plot of a children's book, but these cases appear in dusty records across regions like Savoy, Lombardy, and the Alpine valleys. Amphibians brought before the law, or more accurately, blamed, warned, and occasionally cursed, because to the medieval mind, nothing happened without cause. No creature acted without spiritual implication. Frogs, with their nocturnal noises and slippery bodies, were easily cast as mischievous. Historians still argue whether the clerics believed frogs could intend offense, or whether the trials were symbolic exercises to affirm divine order. But once again, the line between absurdity and belief blurs. The church did not laugh. Instead, they issued formal complaints. They penned letters to the bishop. They asked whether it was appropriate to issue excommunications against frogs. And occasionally, they did. There's a particular record from the 14th century that describes a trial in which the priest, unable to determine which specific frogs were guilty, issued a blanket warning to all frogs within earshot of the chapel. They were given 3 days to vacate the premises, when, predictably, they didn't comply. A formal ecclesiastical curse was issued. Bells were rung. Holy water was thrown toward the marsh. Psalms were sung. The frogs, of course, continued their symphony. The villagers nodded, reassured that divine justice had been delivered, even if the offenders refused to quiet down. And here's the quirky part: some courts insisted on due process even for frogs. A friar from rural Italy recorded that before the excommunication could be pronounced, a representative had to be appointed to speak for the frogs, a legal advocate. It was usually a junior cleric, assigned with what must have been a blend of annoyance and amusement. This unfortunate fellow would then rise in the church, clear his throat, and argue on behalf of the frogs, that they were creatures of God, that their croaking was praise, not disruption, that they had no malice. It rarely worked, but the ritual mattered more than the outcome. You picture the scene: a tiny courtroom set beside a chapel, a sweating monk trying to explain frog theology to an aging bishop, a scribe dipping his quill into ink and writing the words, "The frogs having failed to amend their behavior," with a completely straight face. It's both ridiculous and oddly touching. A community trying desperately to maintain a sense of cosmic order by treating every noise, every ripple in the pond, as part of a moral drama. There's a deeper layer here. Some villagers believed that persistent croaking signaled the presence of witches or demons in nearby waters. Ponds were not just ecosystems, they were portals, boundaries between worlds. And frogs, with their glassy eyes and sudden leaps, seemed too clever by half. They emerged from slime, vanished into reeds, and never bowed to human will. That alone was suspicious. It was a time when too much independence, be it in women, animals, or weather, was met with ritual correction. You remember that in Genesis, frogs were one of the 10 plagues of Egypt. That association never left the collective mind. Even as naturalists began to study amphibians with scientific rigor, rural populations clung to the idea that frog song, when ill-timed, could mean divine displeasure. In one village, during an especially rainy Lent, frogs were blamed for the failure of wheat crops and brought to trial in absentia. The verdict was exile. The punishment priests walked to the pond and waved crucifixes while chanting Latin banishment formulas. And yet, in other corners of Europe, frogs were seen differently. In parts of Bohemia and Poland, some folk healers believed frogs could ward off evil spirits. They were kept in jars under beds, released in fields during planting seasons, or gently rubbed on the skin of sick children to absorb fevers. The same animal hated in one village, revered in another. It depended on context, fear, and who was writing the narrative. You pass through a meadow now, the grasses bending gently in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, frogs are croaking, and you can almost hear the echo of a long-forgotten curse still hovering above the pond. You imagine the priest standing on a muddy bank, robe hitched up, shaking his fist at the reeds, a voice breaking through incense smoke and rising panic. "You have defied the Lord's house." He throws salt into the water. The frogs blink, one splashes, and the ritual is complete. There's humor in it, of course, but there's also sincerity, a kind of theological earnestness that makes you hesitate before laughing too loudly. They weren't trying to be funny. They were trying to restore peace to a world that croaked when it should have been silent, that echoed when it should have absorbed their prayers. And so, they did the only thing they knew: they went to court. You think back to the other trials: the pig in pants, the rooster and its cursed egg, the cats and the whispered secrets of witches, and now the frogs, voiceless but judged. There's a pattern forming, not one of lunacy, but of desperate logic. A belief that if everything could be accounted for, then nothing would be out of place. Even the frogs had to obey the script. And as the moon rises and the fields cool, you finally let yourself imagine it: a trial held at dusk, candles flickering, the air thick with prayer and pond mist, the accused never showing up, yet condemned all the same. And someone, somewhere, in the back pew, suppressing a smile as the frogs croak louder. As you move farther down the winding track of medieval memory, past the frogs' damp tribunal and the flickering torches of fearful processions, You arrive at a cathedral town where the architecture pierces the sky and the bells toll not for worship, but for judgment. This time, the trial isn't held in a dusty village or a forest-fringed chapel. It's in the ornate, echoing chambers of ecclesiastical authority. And the accused insects, not metaphorical ones, actual beetles, locusts, weevils, caterpillars, worms, creatures that chewed, burrowed, buzzed, and bothered, creatures that no human could arrest or interrogate, yet still found themselves called to stand trial. The church, in its moral certainty, took this task with an almost alarming sincerity. These pests were accused of ruining crops, defiling altars, desecrating sacred spaces, and most grievously interfering with divine order. So, they were summoned, formally, sometimes even excommunicated. Historians still argue whether these ecclesiastical animal trials were theological theater or genuine spiritual warfare. What's clear is that they followed real procedures. Proclamations were read aloud, summonses delivered often from the pulpit, and when the insects failed to appear, judgments were rendered in absentia. One of the most infamous cases unfolded in 1519 in the Diocese of Autun, France. A plague of weevils had infested the vineyards, and the monks, desperate to save their harvest, petitioned the local bishop to intervene. The weevils, they claimed, were acting in defiance of divine law. They destroyed the fruits of honest labor, disrupted sacramental wine production, and showed no regard for holy property. The church agreed something had to be done, and so the court assembled. A trial was held, in full accordance with canon law. A prosecutor laid out the charges, citing theological precedent. Animals, being part of creation, owed obedience to their proper place. When they transgressed, especially in ways that harmed human livelihood, they could be punished. The defense appointed. A lawyer stood and argued on behalf of the weevils. His argument, and this is real, was that the insects were also God's creatures, fulfilling their natural role, and that the land they consumed was arguably their domain as much as man's. You pause here, not sure whether to be amazed or exhausted. Somewhere, in a vaulted cathedral, men in robes debated the land rights of bugs. In this case, the judge offered a compromise. The weevils were granted a small section of land outside the village, uncultivated, barren, but technically theirs. The idea was that the church would banish the insects from the vineyards and ask God to herd them into the wasteland. It was spiritual eviction, and of course, it didn't work. The weevils stayed. The crops continued to suffer, but the records don't mention failure. They end with a declaration that justice was served and the community was at peace. It wasn't about outcome. It was about reassurance. The performance of law, even against six-legged creatures, created the illusion that the world was not unraveling. Quirky details bloom everywhere in these trials. One 15th century Swiss priest insisted that the summons to insects be nailed to a tree near the infested fields. The document, written in Latin, politely instructed the caterpillars to vacate the area within 8 days or face divine expulsion. Another case in Italy involved termites gnawing through a church library. The judge, after listening to days of arguments, issued a sentence of excommunication, then ordered the books moved to a safer location, just in case the bugs retaliated. But behind the absurdity lurks a kind of poetic desperation. These were people trying to negotiate with nature in the only language they knew: ritual, scripture, and law. They couldn't poison the bugs. They didn't yet understand pesticides. They couldn't predict infestations or track migratory patterns. So they did the next best thing. They gave nature its own seat in the courtroom and prayed it would behave. The idea wasn't new. Ancient Roman priests performed rites to banish pests. Early Christian monks adapted these traditions, layering them with theology and ecclesiastical procedure. And by the High Middle Ages, the process had calcified into something oddly bureaucratic. There were rules, protocols, witnesses. Some trials lasted weeks. Some were held in multiple sessions, across seasons, with updated charges depending on crop conditions. You imagine a clerk opening a dusty file labeled beetles, repeat offense, and nodding grimly. Scholars still debate whether these insect trials were meant more to punish the bugs or to reassert human dominion. Perhaps both. Insects were small, uncontrollable, unbothered by human authority, yet they could destroy a harvest, ruin a year's labor, and plunge a village into hunger. In that sense, they were terrifying, and terror, when left unnamed, grows wild. These trials gave it a shape. The buzzing in the fields became a legal case. The holes in the cabbage became evidence. The swarm in the sky became a defendant. It was madness. Yes, but madness dressed in clerical robes and powdered with incense. One case from 1543 involved slugs accused of destroying bean crops in the Jura Mountains. The trial was heard in an open-air courtroom, presided over by a bishop's delegate. Witnesses testified to the damage. The defense lawyer for the slugs, a local notary, argued that the land had been improperly tilled and thus invited natural consequences. The judge, clearly exhausted, ruled that the slugs were to be cursed if they remained after a 7-day grace period. Then, to seal the sentence, he had a choir sing a psalm about divine wrath. No mention is made of whether the slugs left. You try to imagine the courtroom decorum clerks with solemn faces, villagers craning their necks, robed officials discussing larval behavior as if it were heresy. Maybe someone giggled, maybe not. In these moments, people weren't mocking the process. They were holding onto it like a rope in a storm. If beetles could be summoned and sentenced, then maybe the chaos of life was not so terrifying after all. Maybe God was still watching, still listening, even to the rustle of wings in the barley. As you walk past the fields where these stories were born, you notice how still the crops are now. No buzzing, no scurrying, just the wind, soft as breath, moving through wheat like an unseen choir. Somewhere, centuries ago, a priest raised his hands and cursed a swarm, believing with every fiber of his being that the words mattered. And maybe they did. Not to the insects, but to the people who needed to believe that anyone was in control. You remain in that same world of medieval legality, but the air feels even stranger now, as if the laws of man and beast have merged into something theatrical, philosophical, and ever so slightly deranged. Because now, you're introduced to a figure who makes this surreal performance complete the animal's lawyer. Yes, we're back in the courtroom, but not to watch judges thunder or villagers weep. This time, you're watching a man stand up and sincerely defend a swarm of insects, a herd of pigs, a murder-prone dog, or even a rampaging bull. He wears robes, holds parchment, and bows to the magistrate just like any human attorney would. And yet, his client cannot speak, cannot gesture, and cannot even show up to court. It's a weevil, or a sow, or a caterpillar with a particularly bad reputation. Still, he must proceed. In some cities, like Lausanne and Autun, the appointment of legal representatives for animal defendants wasn't just tradition, it was requirement, a principle. If you're going to try a creature under law, then it deserves the full dignity of that law, including a defense. This isn't satire. It's embedded in real historical record. The concept is called jus animalium, or the legal rights of animals specifically. Animals seen as capable of causing harm, medieval canon law, as well as local civil codes, sometimes treated animals as moral agents under God. Therefore, if they could sin, they deserved representation. Historians still argue whether this was an extension of justice or an act of projection, turning every animal into a mirror for human failings. Whatever the root, it created a world where attorneys made serious, formal arguments on behalf of beasts that would never understand the concept of guilt. One of the most famous animal advocates was once again Barthélemy Chassenet, whom you met earlier in the tale of the grain-eating rats. But his career didn't end with rodents. He built a reputation as a man of logic, restraint, and absurd poise, handling cases for pigs, goats, and insects as if they were high-profile nobles. He argued that animals had the right to fair summons, that they should be tried in absentia only with great caution, that they couldn't appear in court if their safety wasn't guaranteed, especially when humans, their natural predators, stood present in the gallery. He once defended a group of insects by citing biblical references that described all creatures as part of God's divine creation, and therefore, they were not acting out of malice, but instinct. The argument nearly won. You picture him, adjusting his robes, straightening his scrolls, and addressing the court with the kind of tone usually reserved for inheritance disputes, and the court listened, earnestly. These weren't parodies. The belief was real. The legal structures held. A pig charged with murder had a right to counsel. A donkey accused of trampling a vineyard might receive clemency on the grounds of poor fencing. A rooster's accidental egg could be mitigated if its defense lawyer convinced the court it was a biological error, not a sign of demonic interference. There's something charming and terrifying about this logic. It affirms the dignity of all creatures while simultaneously dragging them into the complex, punitive structures of human society. A sheep can be innocent or guilty. A goat can be sentenced to death, but also forgiven. A dog, if it bites without cause, may be exiled instead of executed. You wonder if the lawyers ever felt a moment of madness standing there, speaking into the silence, arguing with no reply, defending a soul that neither knows nor cares about the outcome. Yet the court record tells us these cases were detailed. Some judgments ran for dozens of pages. In one trial, involving a group of moles destroying farmland, the defense lawyer insisted that the moles had a natural right to dig, and that it was the farmers' poor land stewardship that had invited destruction. The court considered this. They consulted theological texts, then ruled that the moles should be exorcised, but not punished directly, a kind of divine eviction, not a death sentence. In another case from 1587, a lawyer argued that a horse who had kicked its owner was provoked by mistreatment. He cited witnesses who had seen the man beat the horse with a stick. The horse was spared. You almost want to cheer, but then remember a different court, in a different place, might have burned that same horse alive for perceived rebellion. The fate of animals hinged not just on evidence, but on interpretation, on the mood of the judge, on the skill of the lawyer, on whether the animals seemed to carry a trace of something unnatural, too intelligent, too cunning, too free. And yet, this bizarre system inadvertently did something profound. It forced people to look at animals not as background creatures, but as beings entangled in moral consequence. If a pig could be guilty, it could also be innocent. If a donkey could be punished, it could also be protected. You feel the line blur. Justice stretches to include the voiceless, not out of empathy, but consistency. If the law is to matter, it must apply to all who fall within its reach, even those who do not speak. There's a fringe detail in a manuscript from the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Omer, where a lawyer is recorded as having composed a 500-line Latin defense for a colony of termites. In it, he praises the termites' diligence, their devotion to order, and their obvious preference for ecclesiastical wood as a compliment, not a crime. The judge thanked him for his passion and clarity. The termites were not convicted. The monastery, however, replaced all its shelving. You try not to laugh, but there's something gently absurd about it all. The monk writing notes as if termites had nodded in agreement. The judge nodding gravely as the defense quotes St. Augustine to protect a beetle. The prosecutor rolling his eyes, wondering how much longer this hearing must continue before anyone gets to lunch. Yet, behind the comedy is a question that still hasn't left us. What do we owe to creatures who cannot answer back today? We argue about animal welfare, sentience, rights to habitat, freedom from cruelty, but in that long but strange medieval corridor, the conversation was already underway, just framed in velvety absurdity and theological flair. You close your eyes and picture one final courtroom, a cramped stone hall, candles flickering, parchment everywhere, and a lawyer kneeling before a cat in a cage, whispering, "We'll get you out of this." The cat licks its paw, the court is called to order, and somewhere, the bailiff clears his throat to announce, "The case of the people versus the goose of Saint Etienne will now commence." By now, the rhythm of these strange trials begins to settle into something like a lullaby, a procession of courtrooms echoing with Latin, of monks muttering curses at beetles, of lawyers arguing passionately on behalf of poultry and pigs. But what stands out more than any single case is how seriously it was all taken, not as parody, not as play, but as a sacred performance of justice. And this becomes clearest when you realize that in many instances, the animals on trial were afforded more legal care, more ceremony, and more solemnity than many human defendants of the same era. You lean back and absorb this quiet contradiction. The fact that an accused thief or peasant woman might be hauled before a court without counsel, while a pig in the same district might receive an appointed attorney, a public defender, and a full liturgical audience before being sentenced to hang. It's strange, it's absurd, but it's true. This wasn't limited to one curious region, either. From France to Switzerland, From the Rhineland to rural Italy, animal trials followed detailed protocols, summons posted, time granted for appearance, lawyers appointed, evidence reviewed, and in some cases, appeals filed. Yes, appeals. There are surviving records where towns petitioned higher courts to review the verdicts against animals. One town attempted to appeal a sentence against a dog, arguing that the original court had used an improper blessing in their condemnation ceremony. The appeal was denied, but the fact that it existed at all remarkable. Historians still argue whether these efforts were acts of ritual desperation or deeply held legal beliefs. But the meticulousness of the proceedings suggests one thing clearly. This wasn't a joke to them. It was the law, and the law was full of contradictions. In many regions, animals were treated as property. A man could own a pig, a horse, a cow, and sell them, trade them, or slaughter them. But if that same pig committed a crime, it could suddenly be elevated into a moral agent, no longer just bacon on legs, but a citizen of sin. That pig could be tried, executed, and the owner often fined, not for the crime, but for negligence failing to supervise a morally capable creature. The logic is dizzying. One moment, the pig is a thing, the next, a person, then, once sentenced, a thing again, except now, it's a thing that must be hanged in public to restore moral order. It becomes even stranger when you compare these animal trials to the ones held for human defendants of low-status serfs, beggars, outsiders. These people were often tried quickly, sometimes tortured into confessions, and given no real defense. Meanwhile, the trial of a rat colony could take weeks, with elaborate written arguments, clerical debate, and multiple recesses. In one documented case, a human thief was executed on the same day as a pig, but while the man was dispatched behind closed doors, the pig's hanging was held with full ceremony, including hymns, flags, and a paid crowd of witnesses. It's as though the court wanted to put on a show, and what better audience than the entire town? Hungry for both justice and spectacle, there's a deep paradox here that animals, though speechless, passive, and innocent in the eyes of modern understanding, were treated as agents of choice and evil. Humans, in contrast, were often viewed with suspicion, as tools of temptation or carriers of vice, especially if poor or female. So, in a surreal twist, the pig might be given more respect than the peasant, not out of compassion, but out of symbolic necessity. The trial of the pig affirmed cosmic justice. The trial of the peasant was often just social housekeeping. And then there's the way these animal trials intersected with church ritual. In several cases, the sentencing of a creature included mass, exorcism, public confession, and even burial rites. A dog that attacked a priest might be buried in unconsecrated ground, while a pig executed for harming a child might be given a symbolic procession to the execution ground, with nuns singing as they walked. These were not private moments. They were communal catharses. The death of the animal became a vessel through which the town processed its fears of sin, disorder, famine, and death. The beast became the scapegoat, and the court became the priesthood. There's a fringe detail you almost miss in a 14th century French record. A pig is sentenced to death for killing a child, but before the execution, the court orders that it be held in custody and treated with respect appropriate to its condition. What does that mean? Well, they fed it well, they dressed it, they kept it in the same cells used for noble prisoners. The townspeople came to view it, some, apparently, even wept. You're not sure if that's compassion or theater. Maybe both, but the contradiction lingers. This animal is to be killed, but only after being honored, condemned, but with dignity. And again, you contrast this to the peasant accused of stealing bread, who might be lashed and banished without ceremony. It's unsettling. It reveals how medieval justice wasn't about fairness in the modern sense. It was about symbolism, about hierarchy, about reinforcing the moral structure of the universe, even if that structure was built on the backs of the voiceless. And ironically, in doing so, it occasionally granted animals more ritual attention than it gave to entire classes of people. You imagine being there, watching a goose waddle down a path toward judgment, flanked by clerics and children throwing flowers. You imagine a dog placed in a stockade, muzzle-bound, while a town crier reads its charges aloud to a crowd of hushed farmers. You picture the long, legal scrolls, the signatures of bishops and nobles, the official seals affixed to sentences written for creatures who could never read them. The seriousness of it all becomes almost hypnotic, a dream you can't wake from, a pageant of morality acted out on animals because the people couldn't bear to put themselves on trial. There's something else, too, something softer, a kind of early intuition that animals were not just objects. They had wills, habits, patterns, and though the medieval world misread those things as sin or sorcery, it still meant the animals were seen, not always kindly, but certainly noticed. The pig wasn't just meat, the dog wasn't just a tool, the cat wasn't just vermin control. They were part of the moral landscape, entwined with human meaning, given roles in the same great drama that explained weather, war, and disease. And maybe, beneath all the absurdity, there's a kind of awe, a reverence wrapped in fear. These animals lived alongside humans, yet remained beyond full understanding. They behaved strangely. They acted without warning. They stared back with unblinking eyes. And in trying to make sense of them, the courts ended up reflecting the deepest fears of the people that sin has no language, that chaos wears familiar fur, and that justice, to be trusted, must sometimes hang a goat. As the candlelight flickers low and the strange procession of animal trials continues to stretch through your imagination, something new begins to emerge, a realization that these trials weren't just about guilt or innocence, but about spectacle, about ritualized drama that turned the courtroom into a kind of moral stage, with pigs and cows and geese shuffled in like actors wearing fur and feathers instead of masks. The townsfolk didn't merely witness justice, they attended it, like a festival or a holy day. Their expectations as much about story as about law, and you begin to see that these events were not anomalies, they were planned, orchestrated, and deeply anticipated. A trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was entertainment, a break from routine, a moment where the ordinary became absurd, and the absurd became believable. You picture the build-up. Word spreads through the village, an animal will be tried. Mothers gather their children, merchants roll up their stalls to join the crowd. Priests bless the space. A stage is sometimes built, a literal wooden platform for the accused animal to stand upon. There are no curtains, but the pageantry is unmistakable. In some places, music plays before the opening statements, not ironically, but as part of the sanctity of the event. Banners are raised, bells toll, and food stalls appear honey cakes, roasted chestnuts, sour wine in pewter cups. It's justice, yes, but with snacks. Historians still argue whether these trials were community bonding experiences or psychological purges, likely both. The seriousness of the court mixed with the carnival atmosphere gave people a feeling that something was being done, that justice wasn't just a concept, but an experience they could see. You didn't have to understand the legal theory to feel the gravity of a pig in chains, or a dog muzzled and guarded by soldiers. And for many, it was the only theater they'd ever know. One account from 15th century Burgundy describes an entire fair springing up around a trial involving a bull that had gored a child. Merchants from neighboring villages arrived days early to set up tents. A priest gave a sermon about divine punishment and the mysterious impulses of beasts. Local girls handed out garlands. When the bull was finally led into the square, snorting, confused, its hooves muffled by straw, the crowd reportedly fell silent, as if waiting for the curtain to rise. The trial lasted 2 hours. The bull was found guilty. It was executed the next morning by sword, its meat not eaten but buried, to avoid spiritual contamination. You wonder how many in that crowd came for moral clarity and how many came simply to see something happen. There's a quirky detail from 14th century Switzerland. A baker once sold pastries shaped like the animal on trial, pig-shaped cakes for a pig defendant, rooster cookies when it was a bird. Satirical, yes, but also oddly reverent. These pastries weren't mocking the ritual, they were part of it, as if by eating the shape of the offender, the town absorbed and expelled the sin. The trial was public digestion of disorder, a meal of meaning, and this blending of food, faith, and farce wasn't unusual. At many trials, especially those of larger animals, crowds were so large that guards had to form human barriers. The animal was walked in slowly, flanked by clergy and officials, and the act of simply seeing the accused was a highlight. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Some towns even sold rough woodblock prints afterward as souvenir of the day. The ox was sentenced, a proto-mugshot, something to nail over the fireplace and murmur about during long winters. You try to imagine what it felt like to live in a world where these rituals weren't strange, but expected, where the law reached into the barn and dragged out your goat, and no one blinked, where people didn't just obey authority, they watched it, felt it, tasted it. You think of today's true crime dramas, courtroom reality shows, serialized legal thrillers, and you see the same narrative justice, complete with a beginning, middle, and end. But in the Middle Ages, the story had to be lived, not streamed. And so, they brought the court to the square and gave it characters in fur. There's one account where a pig was placed in a mock witness box. Not to speak, of course, but to make the scene complete. The judge directed statements toward it, pausing as if awaiting a reply. The pig blinked, sniffed, perhaps squealed, and the clerk dutifully recorded the silence. That silence was part of the ritual, too. It reinforced the mystery, the solemnity, the weight of what was happening, and the villagers. They didn't laugh, they gasped, they wept, they applauded the verdict, because they weren't watching animals. They were watching justice wear a costume. Not everyone approved, of course. Some clerics criticized these events as distractions from true devotion. A few Enlightenment thinkers would later mock them as the death throes of superstition. But at the time, they persisted, because they offered something more than entertainment. They offered cohesion. A village that gathered to witness a rooster's trial was a village briefly united by curiosity, by ritual, by shared belief, even if the belief was absurd. One fascinating record from 1471 mentions a delay in a trial because the town's only copy of the required blessing had been misplaced. No judgment could proceed until the proper incantations were read. The townspeople waited, the pig waited. The priest sent a messenger to a nearby monastery. The scroll was found and carried back like a sacred relic. Only then did the trial resume, and the entire town stayed. No one left, because even the delay became part of the narrative proof that law was slow, careful, deliberate, like watching a candle melt uneventful, yet somehow hypnotic. These trials weren't just about the animal, they were about the town, about reaffirming that sin, when named, could be cast out, that chaos, once placed in chains, could be controlled, and perhaps most importantly, that the people themselves were not the cause of the misfortune. When a child died, it was the pig. When the harvest failed, it was the weevil. When a procession was disrupted, it was the frog. And once tried, those things could be removed. It was emotional sanitation, legal exorcism, and the townspeople, munching on pig-shaped pastries, went home lighter. You imagine the square once more, now quiet, strewn with hay and candle stubs. The gallows stands empty. The priest has gone. The children are asleep. And tomorrow, someone will sweep the stones and erase the traces of judgment. But for a moment, all felt right. The story had an end. The moral had been delivered. The world, however briefly, was in order. The morning after one of these strange trials is quieter than the performance itself, but the echoes remain chatter over bread, murmured retellings at the well, a strange sense of calm as if something heavy has been lifted. And it's in this moment, this stillness, that you begin to notice something deeper. Beneath the absurd theater of goats on trial and geese in custody, a darker question lingers: why? In so many cases, did the animal receive more public attention, more legal process, and more symbolic ceremony than an ordinary person? The unsettling truth is that medieval animal courts often reflected a bizarre inversion of justice, where beasts were held to standards that human peasants, women, and foreigners were often denied. If the law applied to pigs, it certainly didn't apply equally to people. And that contrast between the gravity given to animals and the haste applied to many human lives cast the whole system in a new light. You begin to notice how some animal courts were nearly indistinguishable from human ones, complete with official robes, legal citations, witnesses, and punishments so elaborate they bordered on reverence. A convicted sow might be dressed in clothes and paraded through the streets before execution, accompanied by armed guards and monks offering prayers. Meanwhile, a peasant accused of a minor theft might be whipped and tossed from town without so much as a hearing. Historians still argue whether this reflected a belief in animal morality, or whether it was simply the court's way of rehearsing justice using animals as manageable actors in a system that often failed to protect the living. Either way, the contrast is impossible to ignore. The animal becomes a symbol, a blank canvas, onto which fears, sins, and grievances are painted in full view. There's a case from 14th century France that illustrates this perfectly: a horse accused of kicking a knight. The trial was elaborate. The horse was brought before a judge. A full inquiry was conducted. The horse's temperament was discussed. The knight's behavior scrutinized. Ultimately, the verdict spared the animal, blaming the incident on poor care and provocation. Yet, in the same year, a servant accused of disrespecting a noblewoman was imprisoned and flogged without defense. You can't help but see the imbalance. The horse, an asset of value, a symbol of martial prestige, received careful legal protection. The servant, a poor woman with no status, did not. The trial becomes a mirror, not for fairness, but for power. And that's when it begins to make sense why some animal trials were more ornate than their human counterparts. It wasn't about justice, it was about hierarchy. Animals connected to important people were tried with pomp because the ritual mattered to their owners. Livestock that disrupted a town's economy or touched something sacred, an altar, a relic. A child received theatrical justice because the community demanded a narrative. Meanwhile, the lives of those at the margins, the hungry, the heretical, the foreign, were often dismissed without script or ceremony. You realize the animal was not the real subject of the trial. The animal was the stand-in for something else. There's even a record of an entire trial being paused because the priest's robes weren't clean enough. The pig would wait, the villagers would wait, until the appropriate level of sanctity was restored. But if a beggar were accused of stealing bread, no such pause, no ceremonial delay, just punishment. You wonder, was this about animals at all, or were these trials rituals of control? Ways to symbolically cleanse a society that could never truly face its own inequities. Yet, paradoxically, it's these same rituals that sometimes offered animals a peculiar kind of dignity. Unlike humans of low status, who could be punished arbitrarily, animals could only be tried if certain legal criteria were met. The offense had to be clear, the witness testimony credible, the trial public, and the verdict had to follow form. One scholar wrote that, in some jurisdictions, animals received the full dignity of the accused. That phrase sticks with you because it implies that dignity wasn't universal, but conditional. You could be born human and still be beneath the law's protection. You could be a goat and still die with a trial, a sentence, and a eulogy. There's a story from rural Germany, early 1500s, about a dog who bit a noble child. The dog was captured, put on trial, and sentenced to death. But before execution, the court allowed the dog to be seen by a local healer to determine if it had been provoked or perhaps mad. The healer testified that the child had taunted it. The sentence was commuted. The dog was spared. In contrast, a human servant accused of breaking a vase was whipped in public without inquiry. The law, it seems, was not about species but about status. It gets stranger. In some regions, specific punishments were designed for different types of animals. Cats might be burned, pigs hanged, dogs drowned. The method matched the supposed crime and the animal's moral nature, and you wonder who decided these codes, who looked at a pig and thought, this deserves the rope, who looked at a rooster and thought, a sword will do. These rituals weren't arbitrary, they were precise, repeated, and formal. The punishments were designed not just to kill the animal, but to restore the illusion of cosmic balance. The crowd didn't just want blood, they wanted order. They wanted to see the rules play out, even if those rules applied to creatures who could never comprehend them. And maybe that's the heart of it. These trials weren't about communication or comprehension. They were about performance, about telling a story, about watching a drama unfold so that life could feel, for a moment, like it followed a script. You imagine the judge adjusting his robes, the clerk sharpening his quill, the the crowd murmuring as the charges are read aloud. Each syllable meant more for the audience than for the animal. The pig hears nothing. The dog watches the crowd. The beetle, if it's even present, continues its slow crawl. But the humans leave believing something sacred has been restored. One curious account from a Spanish village involves a cow who trampled a field dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The priest was outraged. A trial was demanded. Witnesses were summoned. But as the trial proceeded, it became clear that the cow had wandered in by accident. The fence was broken, the altar poorly guarded. The judge, surprisingly, ruled in favor of the cow and ordered the town to pay penance for their negligence. The cow was led home with a wreath of flowers. The villagers were silent. Justice had been served, or so it was believed. And in that belief lies the true function of these trials. They didn't change much. They didn't prevent future crimes. They didn't reform pigs or warn future beetles. But they provided closure, a way for the community to agree this thing happened. And now it has been addressed. Not ignored, not forgotten. Addressed. That mattered. Especially in a world where real solutions medicine, social equality, weather prediction were still centuries away. So, while the human courts dealt in swift, brutal judgment, the animal trials drifted into ritual, into drama, and, strangely, into something like mercy. Because if you hang a pig but give it a lawyer, a summons, a proper burial, and a crowd to witness its death, you've created something more than punishment. You've created meaning, and in medieval Europe, meaning was always in short supply. By now, you're neck-deep in the marsh of medieval absurdity, where the law reaches into henhouses and beetle burrows, dragging every oink, cluck, and rustle into the spotlight of divine order. But as you trudge forward, a new pattern begins to emerge, one that reveals these trials weren't only about animals disrupting life or nature run amok. Some cases held a darker implication, one that crept along the pews and into the corners of the church. Animals accused of sacrilege, not merely killing a child or ruining crops, but desecrating something sacred, holy relics, consecrated bread, even the space of the altar itself. These weren't just crimes, they were blasphemies, and the punishment, predictably, was spectacular. If an animal could offend God directly, then no mere hanging would suffice. It had to be purified, destroyed, and remembered. Take, for instance, the case of a dog in 15th century France that ran into a church during Mass and snatched a consecrated host from the priest's hand. Chaos followed. Parishioners screamed. The priest dropped his chalice. The dog was caught, and soon it found itself not only chained, but placed on formal ecclesiastical trial for theft, for blasphemy, and for attacking the body of Christ. Historians still argue whether the host had been swallowed, trampled, or simply taken. But to the congregation, the exact details mattered little. The symbolism was unbearable. An animal had trespassed into the holiest act of worship, disrupting the fragile veil between heaven and earth. The verdict: execution by fire, carried out at dawn, with prayers of reparation recited afterward for the sake of the entire parish. You begin to sense the unease these incidents stirred. It wasn't just about law. It was about boundary between clean and unclean, divine and profane, human and beast. When an animal entered a sacred space, especially during liturgy, it triggered a kind of spiritual panic. Pigs were particularly suspect. There's a record from Flanders of a sow that wandered into a chapel and defecated near the font. It was tried, convicted, and burned in the town square, not because it posed a threat, but because it had violated something holy. Its body was reduced to ash, its remains buried far from consecrated ground, and its name entered into the parish records not as an animal, but as a transgressor. It's here that the real drama of these trials becomes clearest. These weren't trials in the modern sense. They were rituals. And in ritual, the accused doesn't need to understand the charge. The act itself carries weight. A dog running into a sanctuary, a rooster crowing during the homily, a cat climbing onto a reliquary. These weren't random incidents. They were read as signs, omens, offenses not against men, but against the divine order itself. That made them dangerous. And in the logic of the time, danger had to be purified. One fringe detail comes from southern Italy, where a goat was blamed for damaging a procession of sacred relics. It had broken loose during a storm, bolted through the crowd, and knocked over the platform bearing a fragment of a saint's bone. No one was seriously hurt, but the relic was chipped. The townspeople were horrified. The goat, caught and tethered, was taken to court and accused of malicious spiritualis spiritual malice, a rare and potent charge, usually reserved for the witches or heretics. The goat was executed publicly, and its remains were buried beneath a cross marked with the words, Beatus Ignoris, the ignorant blessed one. You wonder if anyone questioned the logic. Maybe, but no one wrote it down. And this silence, that absence of protest, is what keeps echoing. These communities didn't question whether an animal could sin. They accepted it. They folded it into their cosmology. When a creature touched something sacred, it became a symbol of something gone wrong, an interruption in the harmony between heaven and earth. The punishment, then, wasn't just for the act. It was for the symbolic wound it left behind. Even insects weren't immune. In 17th century Austria, a swarm of flies infested a monastery during a high feast day, crawling over the altar and disrupting the Eucharist. The monks petitioned the bishop for permission to excommunicate the flies. The bishop, perhaps fatigued or amused, granted it. A formal ceremony followed: bells, incense, chant. The excommunication was written, nailed to the chapel door, and read aloud 3 days in a row. The flies, of course, remained, but the monks felt cleansed. The ritual had done its job. It's hard not to smirk at the idea, but then you imagine the tension, the weight of spiritual expectation, the belief that every action had significance, that every symbol had teeth. If your child got sick after the altar was defiled, was it coincidence or was it punishment? The community didn't want to take the risk. The law stepped in, not just as judge, but as priest, as therapist, as storyteller, and the story always needed an ending, even if that ending was a goat in flames. One especially striking case from Spain tells of a cat that interrupted a midnight vigil by climbing onto a casket containing the bones of a martyr. The crowd gasped, some screamed, the monk leading the prayers fainted. The cat was seized, tried the next day, and condemned to death by drowning. The charge wasn't mere disruption, it was intentional desecration of the holy dead. The record includes a chilling line: the beast, being used by Satan to mock the faithful, was silenced by water. As in the flood of old, you pause at the gravity of it. A cat, acting on feline curiosity, suddenly becomes an agent of the devil. But it wasn't just about punishment. These events were about closure. The community needed to know that the line between sacred and profane had been redrawn, resecured. The execution wasn't for the animal. It was for the people. A sign that justice, both earthly and divine, had responded, that the cosmos had not gone blind, that even if a pig could pollute the altar, the court would cleanse it. Some of the strangest records even include formal penance assigned to the townspeople after such trials. In the dog and host case, the priest instructed the congregation to fast for 3 days and attend additional masses to restore balance. In another, villagers were told to re-bless their fields after a goat had crossed a sacred threshold. The trial became the first act, the penance, the second, and the people, once passive observers, became participants in the restoration of order. You look back now and realize these moments weren't really about the animals at all. They were about fear. Fear that holiness could be tainted, that God could be offended, that something as small as a misstep from a creature without a soul could ripple into punishment for the entire town. So they responded the only way they knew how, with ritual, with law, with fire, and rope and holy water. And somehow, amidst all the smoke and silence, it felt right. The animal became the vessel, the trial, the spell, and when it was over, and the square was swept clean, the people went back to their lives comforted by the illusion that the sacred had been made whole again. You step now into the harsher heart of these medieval trials, where mercy turns to spectacle, and the courtroom transforms into something colder, more mechanical, less a church and more a gallows. Because while some of these cases ended with exoneration, exile, or curious compromise, many did not. The overwhelming fate of most animals put on trial was death, and not just quiet, merciful death, but public, elaborate, and often deeply symbolic execution, hanging, burning, stoning. Beheading, each punishment matched not only the crime, but the imagined character of the creature involved. The sow that killed a child might be hanged like a man. A cockerel suspected of witchcraft might be burned like a heretic. A dog that bit during Mass might be drowned, its final whimpers echoing against the stones. It wasn't about deterrence. No rooster learns from another rooster's execution. It was about purification. The sin, no matter how ridiculous its source, had to be expunged. And so, they built platforms, summoned crowds, and carried out sentences with theatrical precision. One of the earliest and most famous of these punishments was the hanging of a pig in Falaise, Normandy, in 1386. You've met her before, the sow who killed an infant and was tried like a human. But what you didn't hear yet is how carefully her execution was staged. She was dressed in human clothes, a jacket, gloves, even breeches. She was led to the gallows on 2 legs, propped upright and flanked by guards. The crowd watched as the noose tightened, and afterward, her body was left hanging for hours, a warning not to other pigs who didn't care, but to people, to remind them that justice saw all, judged all, and required its due, no matter the species. Historians still debate whether this anthropomorphizing was intended to humanize the animal or humiliate it. Perhaps it did both, and it wasn't only France. In 15th century Italy, a mule was sentenced to be burned alive after it kicked a bishop during a procession. The fire was lit at dusk, on a platform soaked in holy oil, as a choir sang psalms over the smoke. In Germany, a dog was chained to a stake and executed by crossbow, an act reserved for assassins and traitors. In a particularly grim case from Spain, a monkey that had been kept as a pet by a suspected heretic was hanged from a church bell tower. Its body left there for 3 days before being thrown into the river. The execution wasn't just punishment, it was spectacle. The animal was made into a warning, a scapegoat, a lesson written in fur and blood. And yet, the rituals remained strangely respectful. There were official scribes, formal sentencing statements, even prayers read aloud before the execution began. In many regions, a priest would bless the execution site, sprinkling holy water over the platform and uttering a prayer for the community's protection. You read one record from a Swiss village where, before a rooster was decapitated, the judge offered it the chance to repent. It didn't, of course. It squawked and fluttered and met the blade. But the ritual mattered. The absurd offer of repentance made the execution cleaner in the eyes of the law. It wasn't cruelty, it was justice. There's a fringe account from Poland in which a group of pigs was accused of conspiring together in a murder. Yes, conspiring. One had gored a young boy, and the others had trampled him. The court ruled that the leader was to be hanged, but that the other pigs, while guilty by association, would be spared if they were relocated and kept under watch. The idea of a murderous pig gang sounds like dark comedy now, but in that world, it was all taken seriously. The death of the lead pig was meant to break the moral infection, to separate sin from the herd. The body was burned, the ashes buried deep. Insects fared no better. Although their executions were less personal, they were no less symbolic. When excommunications didn't work, local clergy might organize mass exterminations as part of religious ritual. A swarm of caterpillars that destroyed a vineyard could be rounded up, scooped into jars, doused with oil, and burned at the edge of the village while prayers were read aloud. In one French parish, monks captured beetles that had invaded their library and crushed them beneath the altar stones. The crushing was described in the record not as pest control, but as cleansing through sacrifice. Even in death, the animals were not just removed, they were judged. You begin to understand just how blurred the line was between sacred and penal, between execution and exorcism. When animals were killed, it was not only to protect people, it was to heal them. The trial was not complete until the death was performed, and the death was not complete until it had been witnessed. There's something chilling about that, something quiet and heavy. A town gathered not only to condemn, but to watch, to confirm, through collective sight, that the chaos had been defeated. And if the execution failed, the consequences could be spiritual. One record from rural Austria describes a failed hanging, when the rope broke and the pig survived. The crowd gasped. The priest insisted this was a sign. Some argued the pig should be pardoned. Others said it was possessed. The judge, wary of divine implication, ordered the pig re-executed, this time by fire. Better to be sure. The logic wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was fear that the ritual might not work, that the evil might not be cleansed, that the line between order and madness was thinner than they could bear. And for the crowd, these executions weren't just events, they were affirmations. They affirmed that the law worked, that justice was real, that sin had a shape, a body, a face, and could be made to disappear. People left these executions lighter, more certain, their daily anxieties buried with the creature whose body they had watched swing, smoke, or sink. It didn't matter that the animal had no comprehension of its crime. What mattered was the script. The story had to play out to the final, irreversible punctuation. You begin to notice how these executions created a kind of local mythology. Villages passed down stories of the beast that defiled the altar, or the pig that killed a prince. Children grew up hearing these tales as both warnings and entertainment. The execution sites became landmarks. Some were marked with crosses, others with simple wooden stakes. A few, with odd reverence, had stones placed around them in circles, as if to remind everyone something unclean was removed here. Do not forget. But the stories never quite fade. In one French village, the tale of a donkey's execution was retold every generation, not because anyone doubted its absurdity, but because it meant something. It gave shape to a past that might otherwise have dissolved into fog. And you realized the ritual wasn't only for the moment, it was for memory, a kind of communal scar that kept the lesson alive. So as you walk away from these executions, you carry something more than just shock or disbelief. You carry a strange kind of reverence for the weight these communities gave to justice, even in its most bewildering form. They needed the rope, the fire, the crowd not for the pig, but for themselves. The execution was an ending, and endings, in a world that feared chaos more than cruelty, were everything. The echo of gallows creaks and embers hissing fades behind you, but something heavier remains, an impression that this whole bizarre theater had rules, a structure, and perhaps, most unsettling of all, paperwork. Because for all its spectacle and superstition, medieval animal justice wasn't ad hoc chaos. It was codified, written down. There were laws, real laws that laid out, in dense, brittle Latin, how and why animals could be charged, tried, and punished. And these weren't marginal footnotes tucked into obscure scrolls. Some appeared in legal texts of real consequence, copied over generations by monks and scholars, sitting side by side with regulations on trade, inheritance, and marriage. You step into one of those law books now, brush off the dust, and squint at the seriousness with which it addresses, say, a cow that tramples a neighbor's field. Not just property damage, not just negligence, but potential moral offense. Depending on the region, the cow might be fined, seized, even executed, and depending on the outcome, the owner might be exonerated or excommunicated. These codes were especially developed in ecclesiastical law, where sin and crime often blurred into each other like ink bleeding across wet parchment. The Decretum Gratiani, a foundational 12th century canon law text, includes clauses on the punishment of animals who harm humans, particularly when it involves sacred persons or spaces. Later editions by jurists like Hostiensis and Durandus went further, prescribing formal trials in cases of grave offense, murder, sacrilege, or public nuisance. Historians still argue whether these texts reflected widespread practice or were more aspirational legal thought experiments, but the evidence suggests they were followed. In court after court, from France to Saxony to Lombardy, judges quoted these laws before issuing verdicts. They didn't see themselves as improvising. They were enacting doctrine. Civil law picked up the tradition, too. In many towns, local charters included stipulations on how to handle misbehaving animals, especially ones that cause bodily harm. In some German regions, if a pig bit a child, the court had to determine whether the animal had acted out of provocation or malice. If it was provoked, the owner paid a fine and the animal was spared. If not, the pig was condemned. The wording is specific. It speaks of the pig's culpable inclination as though it had a will, a temptation, a choice. It's almost surreal, watching the language of theology mold itself to fit the snout of a swine. And the terminology got precise. There were distinctions between ferae naturae wild animals and domata naturae tame ones. A wolf that attacked a shepherd might be feared, but not tried. It had no standing under law. A dog, however, was another matter entirely. It was domesticated, integrated into human society, and therefore subject to its laws. One legal gloss from the 1300s insists that those animals which dwell among men must be judged as men. You pause at that. It's absurd. It's elegant. It's terrifying. If a dog is judged like a man, then the reverse might also be true. Are some men judged as beasts? There's a quirky entry in a municipal code from Aragon that outlines a hierarchy of punishments based on species. Goats could be exiled but not executed unless they had caused death. Sheep, more docile, were generally spared unless found guilty of persistent trespass. Pigs, ever the scapegoats, were treated with the harshest penalties. Chickens, usually spared unless accused of witchcraft-related offenses. You imagine a clerk, pen in hand, debating whether this particular hen looks suspicious enough to warrant trial. But behind the specificity is a deeper structure, an assumption that the world is governed not by randomness, but by order, and that order must be upheld with documents, signatures, seals. There are trial records that include multiple witnesses, legal citations, and even illustrations of the accused. In a preserved case from 1487, a drawing of a donkey is included in the margins of the court file, with a note explaining its notorious expression of insolence. Yes, apparently, the donkey looked rude. You can't tell if that was exaggeration or if the donkey simply squinted wrong at the judge. You walk deeper into the archive and see shelf after shelf of these rulings, often kept with reverence, not because the animal mattered, but because the process did. Medieval law prized process, the idea that everything from a treason trial to a wandering ox could be handled through proper channels. So long as the ritual was followed, the community could accept the outcome. You could burn the pig, drown the cat, exile the goat as long as you did it by the book. Sometimes the laws clashed. In one case from Utrecht, a civil court wanted to spare a dog that had bitten a nobleman, ruling it was provoked. But the local bishop demanded ecclesiastical punishment, saying the dog had disrupted a holy procession. The two courts debated for days. The final compromise, the dog was pardoned, but symbolically banished by being relocated to a monastery farm and forbidden from ever entering the town again. A literal canine exile, somewhere. The paperwork for that ruling still exists, stamped and witnessed. These laws also gave rise to a strange kind of precedent. Later judges referenced earlier trials when deciding what to do. If a pig had been hanged for trampling a nun 50 years prior, then perhaps this new pig, less violent, but equally intrusive, deserved at least imprisonment. And yes, imprisonment. In some regions, animals were kept in cells, fed daily, and guarded like criminals awaiting judgment. A rooster might spend a week behind bars before his sentence was read. A dog might serve months if an appeal was underway. There's even mention of a bull held under armed watch in a barn temporarily consecrated as a makeshift jail. All this raises a haunting idea that justice wasn't about mercy or morality. It was about continuity, about rhythm. The people needed to see the law move forward, step by familiar step. They needed a framework, even if the defendant was a pig who couldn't understand Latin. The law was a machine, and once the gears turned, they had to turn all the way. You find in one Flemish code a clause stating that any animal condemned must be executed in such a way that the people shall see and remember. That's the heart of it, isn't it? Not fairness, not truth, but memory. Justice as a story you could retell, a theater written in ink and blood. Even after these laws began to fade, overturned, or ignored by Enlightenment rationalists, their ghosts remained. Echoes in legal thought, traces in folklore, feigned suggestions in the way we still talk about crime. Think of phrases like scapegoat, or a dog with a record, or leading the lamb to slaughter. The language remembers, even when we don't. You close the book, dust rises, the candle gutters. Somewhere in that old ink is the image of a pig, wearing a tunic, standing trial for a murder it couldn't comprehend. But the trial wasn't for the pig, it was for everyone else. The laws gave the absurdity form, the form gave it weight, and the weight, however strange, made people feel that the world was balanced again. The deeper you wade into this medieval mire of morality and legal parchment, the more you begin to sense a peculiar undertone beneath all the elaborate formality, a tone not of solemnity, but of subtle paranoia. You see it in the margins of court records, in the odd little notations beside verdicts, in the stories passed from town to town. It becomes clearest not in the cities or the monasteries, but out in the wild places on the edge of fields, by the edge of woods where the line between civilization and nature grows thin. Because it's here, in these twilight spaces, that the law didn't just go after pigs or cats or crows. It went after entire categories of animals that didn't just break laws, they escaped them. Livestock that ran loose, wild animals who roamed too close, feral creatures who were once tame, now deemed outlaws in the most literal sense. You walk through the brittle pages and come face to face with a curious phenomenon: animals declared enemies of the community, not just punished for a single act, but banished as permanent threats. The records speak of outlaw goats, of horses expelled from towns, of dogs denied the protection of the law, and suddenly, the courtroom starts to feel less like a church, and more like a fortress with its doors barred against the unruly hooves of the world outside. You find a case from 1323 in rural Burgundy, where a band of goats, having broken through a fence, repeatedly ravaged the local grain fields. The villagers, having suffered for weeks, didn't blame the shepherd. They blamed the goats. They declared the herd contumacious, meaning stubborn, criminally defiant, and the ruling was stark: the goats were to be exiled, not sold, not slaughtered, not confined, exiled. A formal decree was read aloud in the town square, instructing anyone harboring the goats to bring them forward, and warning that should they return, they would be hanged. The goats, unaware of their outlaw status, were herded across the river and released into the woods, left to fend for themselves. The villagers watched them go like a band of cursed fugitives. This wasn't a rare case. In parts of Switzerland and Bavaria, feral dogs that wandered between towns were declared persona non grata, unclean, unclaimed, and no longer protected by the laws of man. Anyone who encountered one was permitted, even encouraged, to kill it. These weren't just stray animals. They were labeled morally suspect, believed to carry disease, unrest, or even the wandering spirits of sinners. One village recorded a sighting of a black dog after an unsolved murder, and after a failed attempt to catch it, the council declared it an agent of instability. The phrasing feels theatrical until you realize that it justified open season. What could not be tamed had to be expelled. Historians still argue whether this was truly legal doctrine or just superstition dressed in judicial robes, but the paperwork remains. Orders stamped, witnesses sworn, names recorded. One Flemish town kept a black book specifically for animals not subject to mercy, listing beasts that had been declared enemies of order. Most were repeat offenders: bulls who broke fences, horses who kicked priests, goats who returned after banishment. A few, however, were listed for reasons as vague as suspicious behavior or unnatural gaze. You raise an eyebrow. What does that even mean? Did someone see a sheep looking too contemplative? There's a fringe detail in a French border town where a horse was sentenced to exile for having resisted bridle and instruction. It had kicked multiple riders, refused to be shoed, and allegedly stared at the bishop with what one witness described as wicked awareness. The court didn't execute the animal. Instead, they banished it from the township entirely. A map was drawn, marking the boundaries it was forbidden to cross. It was branded with a mark to identify its outlaw status and led into the woods under guard. No one was to feed or shelter it again. One final note in the court record reads simply, "Let the wild have what it claims." These trials were not only about individual guilt. They were about creating barriers between the ordered world and the creeping chaos of the wild. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, God above kings, kings above peasants, peasants above animals, any disruption to that chain was dangerous. So when an animal acted with too much independence, too much aggression, It was seen not just as a nuisance, but as a threat to the great order, the punishment banishment, not as mercy but as symbolic expulsion, a ritual casting out of rebellion. Some of these sentences were written with surprising flourish. One record reads, "The beast is hereby declared unclean and without shield. Let no man raise hand to shelter, for the hand shall be stained alike." In other words, help the outlawed animal, and you join its fate. This wasn't just expulsion, it was a moral quarantine. The village drew a line, and anything beyond it was no longer of their world. You feel the weight of that, the fear of infection, not of plague, but of disobedience. And yet, sometimes, the outlaw returned. There's a case from Lombardy where a dog, previously banished for attacking livestock, wandered back into the village months later. The townspeople panicked. The judge ordered the church bells rung as a warning. Children were kept indoors, and the dog, it was captured, chained, and burned in the square, not just as punishment, but as a spectacle of purification. The town held a brief procession afterward, as if to reassert their border had been repaired. You can't help but notice the parallels to human behavior. In an age when exile was a common sentence for heretics, criminals, and the politically dangerous, animals received the same treatment. The logic held what cannot be corrected must be cast out. The medieval town functioned like a body, and anything unclean, unpredictable, or unruly was treated like a disease. Pigs that bit children, cats that loitered in sanctuaries, dogs that barked during holy days. These weren't just annoyances, they were spiritual irritants, and they had to go. One final, haunting entry comes from a town near the Black Forest. A group of crows had taken to gathering in the churchyard, cawing loudly during services. The villagers believed the birds were mocking the prayers sent by evil forces to disrupt sanctity. A formal decree was issued. The crows were declared under malediction. The record notes that crossbowmen were stationed around the church. Those that were shot fell into silence. Those that escaped were, in the words of the clerk, cast into shadow and forgotten. It reads like a poem, or a spell, and maybe that's what it was, because in the end, these outlaw sentences weren't about animals. They were about fear, about borders, about the desperate need to say, this thing does not belong here. And when killing it wasn't possible or politically desirable, banishment became the next best ritual. The animal disappeared, the problem vanished. The line, once blurred, was redrawn. So the goats flee into the forest. The horse disappears into the fog. The crows vanish into the trees. And the town exhales. Not because they are safe, but because the illusion of safety has been restored. The forest closes in behind the outlawed goats and exiled horses, and as their hoofprints fade into mud and memory, you find yourself walking into one of the strangest and most elaborate episodes in the entire history of animal trials, the Rats of Autumn. This wasn't a trial for a single creature, nor a symbolic event meant merely to teach a lesson. It was a full-blown legal showdown, complete with plaintiffs, defense attorneys, court summons, multiple continuances, and a city caught in a surreal tug-of-war with an invisible defendant. The rats were real. The damage they caused was real. But the response was a masterpiece of medieval legal theater. In the early 1500s, in the ecclesiastical court of Autumn, France, a group of townspeople brought a formal complaint against a population of rats for the crime of destroying their barley crops. And not just any barley, blessed barley, church-owned, sacred. The court accepted the case, and from there, things only grew more bizarre. The rats were summoned to appear in court. The summons was read aloud in various public places, as per custom on street corners, near grain stores, and at the edge of the fields. It was read in Latin, and, one must imagine, mostly to the wind. The expectation, at least procedurally, was that the rats, having been made aware of the charges, would present themselves before the court to respond. Of course, they didn't, but that didn't mean the trial stopped. The court simply appointed a lawyer to defend them. That lawyer, astonishingly, was none other than Barthélemy Chassagne, the same legal prodigy who had once defended mice and would go on to become one of France's most respected jurists. In this case, his task was clear: argue, sincerely and without irony, on behalf of rats who had no intention of showing up. And Chassagne took it seriously. His defense began with a procedural objection. The summons had not been issued in a manner sufficient to reach all the accused. Rats, he argued, did not all dwell in the same parish, nor were they always in attendance at marketplaces. Therefore, the court's notification was invalid. The judge, instead of dismissing the claim outright, considered the argument. He agreed. A second summons was issued, broader, louder, delivered from more pulpits, with more ceremony. But still, the rats didn't come. So Chassanet objected again. This time, he argued that his clients were unable to appear because doing so would place them in grave danger. The journey from their homes to the courthouse would require crossing open terrain patrolled by cats, dogs, and humans hostile to rodents. Therefore, it was unreasonable to expect them to appear unless safe passage was guaranteed. Historians still debate whether Chassanet believed what he was saying, or whether he was simply playing the system with the kind of genius that reveals its own madness. Either way, his arguments worked. The court postponed the trial again and again, until eventually, the case was dropped not because the rats were acquitted, but because the law had no mechanism for compelling them to appear. It was, in effect, a procedural victory. The rats had won. This wasn't a sideshow. It was official, documented, preserved in legal records. It wasn't hidden or mocked. It was admired. Chassanet's performance became legendary, not just for its creativity, but for its adherence to the law's internal logic. He hadn't ridiculed the court, he had outplayed it. His defense had followed the rules so precisely that the absurdity collapsed under its own weight. And in doing so, he highlighted something important, that medieval justice, for all its strangeness, demanded consistency, even when the defendants were rodents. There's a quirky moment in the proceedings when the court clerk notes that the rats may have failed to attend, but they have not refused the authority of the court. You pause there. It's a ridiculous line, but also a profound one. It reveals how deeply the court believed in its own structure. The law was a net, and even if the fish swam through the holes, the net still had to be cast. Better to uphold the form than abandon the illusion. And this formality wasn't confined to rats. Similar cases unfolded across Europe. In one case, snails were summoned to leave a vineyard. In another, a swarm of locusts was told to abandon a town's wheat fields or face excommunication. In each instance, when the animals didn't appear, their defense lawyers often used the same strategy: question the summons, question the safety, question the process. It was law as ritual. Theater performed with ink and bell and silence. You think about the rats now, not as vermin, but as legends. They never asked to be involved. They just did what rats do: survive. They chewed grain, built tunnels, hid from sunlight. But somehow, they became adversaries in a courtroom battle that still echoes in law books centuries later. You imagine a courtroom filled with humans, solemn and robed, debating the intentions and rights of creatures too busy gnawing on barley stalks to care. It's funny, but it's also a little tragic, because what does it say about a society that needs to put rats on trial in order to feel sane? It says they were scared of hunger, of failure, of chaos. The rats weren't the real enemy. The real enemy was uncertainty. If the harvest failed, if food spoiled, if the winter stretched too long, what then? But if you could name a culprit, if you could file a complaint, if you could issue a summons and follow the process through, then you hadn't lost control. Not yet. And so, the rats became scapegoats, silent, untouchable, victorious in their absence. They gnawed and fled and reproduced, indifferent to the parchment and the priests. But their presence in the courtroom was real. Their shadow lingered on the benches and the scrolls. And for the people of Autumn, that was enough. The world made sense again. The system had been tested and had responded, not effectively, not practically, but ritually. There's one last note in the court file, a line added by a scribe, possibly years later, in faded ink. It reads, "The grain is gone, but the law remains." You sit with that for a long time, because it captures the entire madness. The rats ate the food, the people suffered, and yet they clung to the structure that had failed to stop it, because abandoning it would mean admitting that the world was governed not by order, but by chaos. So the rats lived, the grain vanished, the court recessed, and Chassanet became immortal not for saving people, but for defending the impossible, for speaking on behalf of the silent, for playing the game to its logical, ludicrous end. And somewhere, beneath the floorboards, the rats kept chewing. You linger in the quiet courtroom where the rats have vanished and the clerk's ink has dried. And though your eyes scan the brittle parchment and fading notations, something else now begins to stir. Not another trial, not another animal, but the slow unraveling of it all. The absurdity had held for centuries, protected by solemnity, by robes and bells and ritual chants. But as the 15th century gave way to the 16th, and then the 17th, the rope began to fray. Enlightenment flickered at the horizon, carried not by torches but by inkpots, by letters exchanged between men who questioned everything, including whether it made sense to dress a pig in breeches and hang it in a town square. The animal trials didn't vanish overnight. They wheezed, they stumbled, they became awkward reminders of an earlier time, like ghostly reenactments of a fading theology. And the men who now stood at the edge of modern thought, humanists, rationalists, philosophers, began to whisper and then declare that it was time to stop pretending the rooster understood his charges. One of the first and most vocal critics was Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher best known for popularizing the essay. He found the trials embarrassing, though not for the reasons you might assume. He didn't mock the villagers. He didn't sneer at the priests. What troubled him was the arrogance of it all, the assumption that humans could judge animals by human standards. He wrote that to understand animals, one must first understand that their lives are not ours, their instincts not ours to command. It wasn't merely that trying a goat was absurd, it was that pretending a goat owed you explanation was a form of blindness. Montaigne's skepticism was gentle, but it landed like a hammer. It opened a door. Others walked through. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment directly ended the animal trials or whether their disappearance was incidental, a side effect of legal reform, economic change, and the slow centralization of secular power. But the timeline is hard to ignore. As reason became fashionable, the old rituals began to seem grotesque. Universities rewrote their curricula, legal codes were edited, the ecclesiastical courts lost authority, and the animal trials, once so proudly filed and preserved, started to fade. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough that by the early 1700s, to try a pig for murder was increasingly seen not as necessary, but as provincial, even backwards. You stumble across one of the last serious trials in history, a sow tried in 1740 in Savoy for injuring a child. The court followed the old procedures, summons, witnesses, formal judgment, but the tone had changed. The scribes were drier, the language more mechanical. The priest, instead of invoking demons, spoke only of danger and property. The pig was executed, yes, but the execution read more like pest control than theology. The magic was draining, the performance was thinning out. And yet, even as these rituals waned, they didn't quite die. They transformed. You see them echoed in odd places in the rise of public punishment for strays, in the bureaucratic language used to justify exterminating entire species, in the strange legal gray zones that define animal status even today. Because for all our progress, our courts still hesitate when it comes to the question, what is an animal under the law? Property, person, partner, threat. The medieval mind answered boldly, if wrongly, ours often sidesteps. But even as the courts let go, the culture clung on. Folktales still whispered of demonic pigs and talking cats. Paintings lingered with scenes of chained animals standing before a judge. Children's stories reimagined the trials as moral lessons, sometimes funny, sometimes terrifying. And the deeper you look, the more you see it that the logic of the animal trial never really left. It just slipped sideways into metaphor, into performance, into the way we still ritualize blame, into the way we look at something beyond our control and declare, it must answer for this. There's a quirky example from 19th century France, when a village organized a mock trial for a rooster, whose early morning crowing had disrupted a mayor's sleep. The rooster was put in a miniature stockade. Local children served as jury. The whole event was staged as a joke, but beneath the laughter, you sense the ancient rhythm returning. The animal is summoned. It is blamed. It is punished. Not because it understands, but because we need it to be part of the story. And that story endures. In modern times, we've seen dolphins classified as non-human persons. We've seen great apes granted limited legal protections. We've seen trials where dogs have been euthanized for cause and legal documents drawn up to determine if parrots can testify in domestic disputes. We've come far from the pig in pants, but maybe not as far as we like to think. One particularly surreal echo comes from a 2010 case in India, where a monkey that had attacked a village was imprisoned in a holding cell and later transported to a wildlife reserve only after a formal complaint, a police report, and a public review of intent and pattern of aggression. The monkey didn't understand any of it, but the villagers did. They watched, they gathered, they nodded as the sentence was carried out. The illusion held. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because for all our sophistication, we still perform these rituals. We still search for the moment when chaos can be turned into structure, when accident becomes crime, when pain becomes fault. And often, we still use the old symbols animals, strangers, scapegoats to make it happen. You walk through a museum now, one that holds the last fragments of the old record's yellowed pages, wax seals, the sketch of a rooster mid-trial. You read the language, formal and flat, and you imagine the faces behind it. The child who died, the farmer who wept, the judge who believed, the pig who knew nothing and died anyway. The Enlightenment didn't erase those moments. It dimmed them, filed them away, but it couldn't destroy the need for them, because law, at its core, is theater, and every theater needs a stage, an audience, and a villain. When that villain is voiceless, the silence lets us hear what we truly fear: randomness, loss, guilt, and the unblinking face of nature that never explains itself. So the animal trials didn't end. They evolved, from parchment to protocol, from ritual to paperwork, from bonfire to bureaucracy. And you sitting here, in a world of pet laws and animal rights and courtroom dramas still obsessed with intent, can trace the line all the way back to that first moment someone stood up in court and asked the bailiff to bring forth the defendant pig. It's tempting to laugh, but maybe laughter is what keeps the absurdity at bay. Because to take it seriously, to realize that we have always needed something other to blame, something silent to carry our noise, would be too much. Better to say it was all superstition. Better to believe we've moved on. But somewhere in the folds of law, in the language of guilt and punishment, the ghost of that old trial waits, watching, listening, quietly chewing on the corners of the verdict. You walk away from the old courtroom's dust and parchments, but you're not free of it. Not really. The image of a pig in breeches, the slow roll of legal Latin accusing a rooster of laying a cursed egg, the prayer of excommunication cast toward a beetle-infested vineyard, all of it follows you like a fog you can't quite shake. And as the strange echoes of the medieval trials fade into the Enlightenment's more clinical rationalism, you start to wonder why this history still matters, why this slow parade of animals standing trial continues to gnaw at the edges of our understanding, like the rats of autumn chewing silently at sacred grain. Because the truth is, the animal trial is not some dusty curiosity. It's a mirror, one cracked, soot-stained, and hard to look into, but a mirror all the same. It reflects not the guilt of goats or the crimes of crows, but something much stranger, much more human: our desperate, relentless need to assign blame, to impose narrative on chaos, to transform suffering into a courtroom scene with defined roles and a final verdict. That's why they dress the pigs in human clothes, not to mock them, but to complete the illusion. If the animal could be made to look like a person, then its punishment could feel like justice. The trial became a kind of alchemy, transmuting randomness into ritual, senseless tragedy into something that looked like order. And we needed that because the alternative was too terrifying. To admit that the child's death was random, that the crop failed for no reason, that the pain had no moral cause, that would be to stare into a void too deep for most communities to bear. The animal trial wasn't about the animal. It was about holding the universe together with rope and ink and ceremony. And you begin to notice how that rope was never entirely cut. We still do it. Not with pigs on gallows, perhaps, but in more refined ways. A dog bites someone, and suddenly there are hearings, behavior assessments, court decisions on euthanasia. Not long ago, A tiger escaped a circus enclosure and killed a handler. Before the grief had time to breathe, the court was asking, did the tiger act in aggression or panic? Could it be held responsible? You blink. What would responsible mean for a tiger? Does it matter? Maybe not. But what matters is that we asked, that we needed a framework, even if the framework was built for humans, even if the subject couldn't speak. You remember that infamous line, let the wild have what it claims, and wonder if the wild ever really does claim things, or if we simply place our fears there, because in so many of these medieval trials, it wasn't really nature on trial. It was disobedience, unpredictability, the feeling that something had stepped outside the boundary of what was allowed, and we haven't abandoned that instinct. We see it every time someone says there must be consequences before they understand the cause. Every time a tragic accident becomes a televised trial. Every time the legal system creaks to life in response to grief, not guilt. There's a scholar who once wrote that law is society's way of telling a story about itself, and the animal trials were an early version of that story, clumsy, theatrical, soaked in incense and superstition, but effective. They allowed the town to say, we are not helpless, we have process, we have order, even if the defendant was a beetle, even if the courtroom was a barn. And so, the pigs were hanged, the roosters beheaded, the goats exiled, not because they posed ongoing threat, but because their deaths turned the senseless into something that felt righteous. A pig killing a child is horror. A pig tried and hanged is justice, or at least something adjacent to justice, close enough that people could sleep again, close enough that the priest could ring the bell and tell the congregation, it has been done. But sleep, of course, is not the same as peace, and the trials didn't truly resolve the fears that sparked them. The rats came back, the weevils returned, another child would die, the stories would shift, the blame would move. Yet each time, the performance would begin again, new defendant, same script. The law wasn't solving a problem, it was protecting a narrative. The narrative that the world is made of causes and effects, that suffering can be put in chains, that even silence animal, mindless, innocent silence can be made to confess. You wondered, then, what we lost when we stopped putting animals on trial. Yes, we gained rationality, humane treatment, scientific understanding, but we also lost a certain kind of ritual honesty, a way of admitting, in code, that we were terrified and needed someone, anyone, to carry the burden. And in modern courts, stripped of pigs and roosters, we sometimes still reach for that ritual in subtler ways. A child drowns in a public pool, and we don't ask why, we ask, who failed? And when no person has failed, we look wider. The lifeguard's schedule, the design of the fence, the timing of the storm. Always there must be a defendant. Always there must be fault. Because fault is easier than grief. Punishment is easier than acceptance. And if a pig once stood trial in a human courtroom for the murder of a boy, maybe it was not the people who were mad, but the people who were honest about how much they needed the illusion that suffering could be explained. You pass a modern courtroom and wonder how it would look to a medieval judge. There are no animal trials now, but the structure remains. The robes, the oaths, the gavel, like a sacramental bell. You read the headlines, a service dog bites a passenger. A zoo chimpanzee escapes and must be put down. And though there's no priest reading from parchment, the logic hasn't changed. The public demands the same script. An incident, a charge, a punishment, a forgetting. Even in our language, the echoes linger. We still say witch hunt. We still say scapegoat. We still say kangaroo court. The vocabulary of symbolic blame is older than we remember. And at its center, often, is an animal. Not because animals are guilty, but because they're easy to cast in roles they can't reject. They don't argue. They don't contradict the script. They just stand there, breathing, until someone decides what they mean. And maybe that's the most haunting legacy of the animal trials. Not the punishments, not the rituals, but the way they taught us to assign meaning to the meaningless. To see a goat trample an altar and declare it an act of spiritual rebellion. To see a rooster's egg and cry out witchcraft. To see a rat infestation and believe it a cosmic betrayal. They taught us that no event should remain unexplained, that the world is not allowed to be chaotic, that even the dumbest creature must be given a role in the human narrative of sin, judgment, and redemption. And so you step back from the archive of these trials, carrying with you not just the strangeness of pigs in pants or frogs being summoned to court, but something much more difficult, the understanding that these were not foolish people in foolish times. They were people like us, desperate to believe that the world could be named, tried, and made clean. They wrote verdicts against animals not because they were cruel or stupid, but because they were human, and because grief needs form, and because fear is always hunting for a defendant. So the next time you hear someone say, "What kind of world puts an animal on trial?" you'll know the answer. This one, our world. A world still afraid of silence, still afraid of the unknown, still, in its deepest chambers, aching for justice even if it has to build a courtroom out of myth and put a goat on the stand. You've followed this long, slow march from the first bell-rung summons to the last echo of enlightenment doubt, and now the story begins to dim like torchlight at the edge of a festival. But before it fades completely, you find yourself pausing to ask the final, inevitable question. Why does this matter now? Why should the memory of a rooster on trial, or a pig in execution garb, hold any weight in a world of satellites and civil codes? You could argue it doesn't, that these stories are curiosities, like dusty coins from a kingdom that no longer exists, but that would be missing the point, because beneath the absurdity, the laughter, the disbelief, lies something profoundly human, something still alive, even now. The history of animal trials is not about animals, it's about people, and the lengths they'll go to explain the unexplainable. It's about the need to make meaning from pain, to ritualize chaos, to see justice not as a tool, but as a shield against the cold reality that sometimes things simply happen. A pig bites a child, a crop dies, a rooster lays an egg, and in the face of that confusion, humans build a courtroom not because it's rational, but because it gives shape to their fear. What lingers most in your mind isn't the verdicts or the sentences, but the process, the way entire communities gathered to listen, to watch, to believe, the way judges put on their robes and scribes sharpened their quills, as though everything depended on whether or not a mouse could be convicted of grain theft, the care taken to read the charges, the solemnity of the oaths, the absurd formality of trials that no one, not even the participants, could truly justify. And yet, they proceeded, not because the outcome mattered to the animal, but because the performance mattered to the people. It was ceremony in its purest form, a collective moment of agreement that, however briefly, there was a moral universe, and it had rules, even if those rules were whispered to a beetle in Latin. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the firewood stacked beneath the condemned, not the ink-stained scrolls of testimony, but the ritual itself, the human impulse to sanctify meaning where there may be none, to respond to unpredictability with procedure, to meet silence with judgment. And when you look around now, centuries later, you realize not much has changed. We still crave justice more than we understand it. We still want villains, even when none exist. We still write long, precise policies for things we can't control. We just do it with digital files instead of parchment, with security footage instead of sermons. But the rhythm, the tone, the instinct, they remain. You think back to Chassanet, the lawyer who defended rats. He could have mocked the court, rolled his eyes, refused the case, but instead, he stood and spoke as if those rats were citizens, as if their journey to the courthouse was no less perilous than a man's. It was theater. Yes, but theater with a strange kind of integrity. He played the part seriously because everyone needed him to, not for the rats, for themselves. So they could leave the courtroom feeling that the world, however briefly, made sense. And what of the animals themselves? They don't leave records. They don't appeal their verdicts. They don't write memoirs of survival or injustice. But they were there, bound, dragged, caged, paraded. They were named. They were punished. They were mourned or not. And in their silence, they became vessels mirrors into which a society poured its fears, its guilt, its stories about itself. Some were spared, some were hanged, some were burned. All of them, in one way or another, were used. And that usage, while ritual, while symbolic, while framed in justice, was still real. But perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: it worked, not in any practical sense. The rats came back, the crops still failed, but the people slept easier. The crowd left the square whispering that the sow had paid for its sin. The villagers nodded to each other in quiet relief. The chaos had been addressed. Something had been done. And if that something involved dressing a pig in pants or warning beetles to vacate the premises, well, so be it. The act of trial was not for correction. It was for closure. And this is why the history persists, not because of what it did to the animals, but because of what it revealed about us. That we are, at our core, narrative creatures, that we need cause and consequence, that we'll invent villains if none are available, that we'd rather try a goat than accept that sometimes the world simply frays without meaning. The animal trial wasn't madness. It was ritual method for people who could not bear to live without story. So now, centuries later, when a community mourns a tragedy and looks for someone to punish, when headlines scream for answers before the facts are clear, when a pet is put down for safety, though no one is sure what really happened, you might remember the courtroom in autumn. You might picture the bailiff calling the rats to stand, and you'll understand that what you're witnessing is not justice. Exactly. It's ritual. It's fear made legible. It's the echo of something very old and very tired, still trying to calm a frightened heart with a ceremony that makes no sense but feels true. The courtroom may no longer call for pigs. The gallows may be empty of cows and cats, but the impulse to assign fault, to perform judgment, to offer the illusion of moral closure that lives on, in every hearing, in every ruling, in every hushed crowd waiting for the verdict that will make their world right again. The animals have left the stand, but the stage remains, and so you step back from the long, strange corridor of animal justice with something heavier than you expected. Not amusement, not revulsion, but recognition. Because somewhere in the courtroom's dust, you see yourself, asking questions you can't quite voice, hoping that guilt can be measured, and pain can be punished, and that order fragile, trembling can be restored. And now, as the final page turns and the last candle gutters low, you feel the story settle not with a bang, not with a judgment, but with a breath, a long, slow exhale from a world that once put frogs on trial for croaking during mass, and mourned the theft of a sacred wafer by a dog that didn't know better. The courts are empty now. The scrolls are closed. The animals are gone. Some into legend, some into shadow, and some into that place where forgotten rituals quietly sleep. And you're still here, listening, resting, perhaps wondering what it says about us that we once demanded apologies from creatures who couldn't speak. But maybe that's the point. Maybe this history, as strange as it is less about understanding them and more about understanding ourselves, our fears, our need for stories, our aching need to name the unnameable, to say, this happened, and here is why. Even if the why is a goat, even if the why is a beetle, let that be enough for now. Let the silence be your answer. Let the absurdity soften into calm. The world, in all its chaos and reason, continues to spin. No judgments tonight, no verdicts, only the slow return of stillness. The court is adjourned. The lights dim. The field outside rustles with life unconcerned with our laws. Sleep now.